And I'm going to give an update on our data on the BMN 270 program. These are my disclosures. Now, as many of you will know, we've already presented this data and published the first year's work. And today I'm going to talk about an update of the 201 study, which is at the top. I will go into some detail just to provide a background for this study in a minute, but essentially that's what we're going to focus on today. However, at this point, I thought it would be useful just to highlight the other components that we have in this clinical trial program. We have two non-interventional components, a global serial prevalence study looking at AAV antibodies, and we have a non-interventional study to collect solid and detailed bleed data prior to running into two treatment arms, Generate-1 and Generate-2, using two different doses of BMN 270, one at 6E13 and one at 4E13. There is also a separate study, 203, which will be looking at patients who have pre-existing AAV5 antibodies in a dose escalation program. That is slightly separate to what we're going to talk about today and the trials above, which are clearly going to be targeted to those that are AAV5 negative. So that's the overall program, but what we're going to talk about today is the 201, which contain patients treated on the 6E and 4E doses. Sorry. Just to remind everybody, BMN 270 or Valrox is an AAV5 vector containing a factor VIII codon-optimized cassette with a promoter, and that this is a cassette that is very similar to R8SQ or Refacto. As I've mentioned, we have selected patients that are AAV5 negative by humoral immunity. In this study, we screened 21 patients and 2 were found to be positive by total antibody. We enrolled 15 patients, as we'll see in the next slide. So the initial study, just to recap, was 15 patients with 4 doses. The first patient was dosed at 6E12, and as he failed to reach the predetermined level of 5 units per deciliter factor VIII at 3 weeks, we then cycled up to the next dose of 2E13. And if that patient failed, we would then move on to the next dose at 6E13. Clearly, that is what we observed. The first 2 patients didn't reach the predetermined target of 5 units per deciliter. We then enrolled 7 patients at 6E13, and subsequent to that, did a second cohort at a slightly lower dose of 4E13. Those 13 patients in those 2 cohorts will form the bulk of what I'm going to talk about today. But if we look right across the board at the whole 15 patients, we can see on the right-hand side of this panel the demographics of this group. We had the majority of patients on prophylaxis prior to treatment, but we did have 1 patient who had been treating themselves on demand. Out of all the patients that entered into this study, only 2 had no bleeds prior to enrollment in this BMN 270 program. We can also see in the panel below the prophylactic therapy bleed rates. So the historic annualized bleed rate, the median for the 6E13 cohort for the 6 patients that were on prophylaxis was 16, and for the 4E13 cohort was somewhat lower at around 8. The on-demand patient had an ABR of around 25. So the selection for the 4E13 cohort wasn't specific. This was just random that they happened to have a lower ABR overall. You can also see that the vast majority of patients had target joints, 80% of them. and we had a splattering of patients with hepatitis B or hepatitis C in their previous histories. We've presented this data, as I mentioned before, but just to recap, we continue to have a very favorable safety profile in this program. We've already previously mentioned the observation of raised ALTs and transient transaminitis, which we saw in 3/4 of the subjects, but this was all transient and has fully resolved in all cases. Most of the cases were just of grade 1 elevation and one was a grade 2. The median point of onset was around 8 weeks, and the maximum duration, but in many patients, was substantially lower than 25 weeks. It was the observation that we saw. All the subjects who had ALT elevations ended up on steroids. The protocol for steroids was slightly different from the 6E13 and the 4E13 cohort, but nonetheless, all came off steroids and remain off steroids. Importantly, as we are aware, for all trials with hemophilia A, no subjects developed any inhibitors and no subjects have withdrawn. We did see 2 serious adverse events, both self-limited and both clearly unrelated to the program. The first was a pyrexia which resolved overnight after the initial infusion, and the second was an SAE that involved elective total knee replacement surgery. We have seen, of course, other AEs, as you would expect in this population, across all the dose cohorts, the most common being the liver transaminitis, as I've mentioned, but other features of arthralgia. 80% of our patients did have chronic arthropathy, as we saw in the previous slide, and other things such as headache and back pain and virus infections. This slide shows our longer-term position and data on annualized bleed rates. And we've taken this data from 4 weeks after the infusion. On the left-hand panel, we have the 6E13 dose. And we see there the median and mean pre-treatment ABRs in the patients on prophylaxis. And as you can remember from the previous slide, we saw a median of 16.5. Post-infusion, this has dropped to a median of 0 and a mean of 0.5. Prior to the enrollment in the program and prior to treatment with BMN 270, only 15%, so essentially 1 patient, was bleed-free in this group. In year 1, 71% of the patients remained bleed-free, which is essentially 5 out of 7, and in year 2, 6 out of 7 patients remained bleed-free at 86%. All 7 patients in this program are now off prophylaxis, and there has been 100% resolution of target joints. If we look on the right-hand panel, we can see the 6 patients in the 4E13 cohort. And again, we see the median pre-ABR of 8 and the post-treatment median of 0. The means are also provided there. Pre-treatment, only 1 patient had no bleeds, whereas post-treatment, 5 out of the 6 had no bleeds. That's 86%. And again, all patients are off prophylaxis. For the patients that did bleed, in both cohorts, it's notable that they both had very significant knee arthropathy. And in the 6C13 cohort, that was the patient that required the elective total knee replacement. In the 4E13 cohort, our patient there has very significant arthropathy and did have chronic synovitis initially, which is now resolving, but he remains with significant arthritis and actually has a manual job as well, which compounds issues. Let's now look at treatment that has been required, and this clearly is going to follow a very similar pattern to the data that we would have seen for the ABRs. High levels of pre-treatment, pre-infusion requirement for clotting factor concentrates in both 6E and 4E13 cohorts, which profoundly drops after treatment with BMN 270. As you'll see, the 6E13 data is through to 2 years, whereas the 4E13 data is through to 1 year. And again, we've accounted for the patients that have bled. In the 6E13, it's worth pointing out that the mean here represents the total knee replacement, where the patient received 36 infusions of factor VIII concentrate to cover the surgery over a 1-month period. So we see substantial reductions in the high 90s in treatment requirement. I'm also going to talk about quality of life. Now, what we did here was we did the quality of life assessments and we measured the mean change in the quality of life scores as we went through. The dotted line here represents the score above which we would regard as a significant improvement in quality of life. This is the highest to date change in quality of life that's been recorded in a factor concentrate-based clinical trial, the SPINARC trial. This is the 6E13 data, and I think we can quite clearly see that there is significant and substantial improvement in quality of life across all the domains. I'm going to put on the 4E13 data here, and you might see and say that this is lower, and indeed it is, but they started off at a significantly higher mean quality of life, and so the mean change in quality of life was proportionally lower because there was a 10-point difference in the starting point. Also, the second point to mention is that week 52 data here, though we've included it, is incomplete and only represents half the cohort because we're collecting the data as we reach the 52-week point. In terms of factor VIII activity level over the period, this is the 4E13 cohort, and we can see that it's leveling out and settling and tightening up. And in the, I think we've missed a slide here. I apologize for this. There is a 6E13 slide on this, which appears to have disappeared, which also shows the same pattern of tightening of the factor VIII expression and a settling into the normal range. No patients in that group are in a factor VIII level above the normal range either. Now, one of the things that we have also seen, which is unfortunately not on the slide that's in this deck for some reason, is that there has been a settling, as I mentioned, of the factor VIII level. And when we look at other gene therapy programs, we can see that there is also a settling of the initial level. This is the data from Amit Nathwani's study in 2014. Some 4 years ago, looking at patients treated with a factor IX program and following them out to 3.5 years. And you can see that there is a settling of the factor IX level. If we look at other AAV programs, we also see durable expression and a settling out of levels. This is data that was originally looking at long-term expression of AAV. The top panel looks at expression of erythropoietin under a tetracycline promoter. And what we can see here is that at 5 years, there is still stable expression of erythropoietin under the tetracycline promoter. What we can also see below, which is a CTLA4 transgene, is continued expression at around a year, but we see that the levels are again settling out over a period. Within the BMN 270 program, we've again seen a peak level which settles out over time. This is non-human primates shown in the top panel on the left-hand side, where we see stable expression. And the data below represents factor VIII in non-human primates, immunosuppressed, and again you see the same pattern of long-term stable expression. So in summary, Valrox has been well tolerated with a very favorable safety profile. No patients are now above the normal range, and the ALT levels, the transient transaminitis that we saw, is normal in all subjects. All our patients are off corticosteroids, and we have seen no inhibitors. We reported the 2 previous serious adverse events, as we mentioned. There has been a profound reduction in bleeding in both cohorts, the 6E and 4E13 cohort, with a similar observation in terms of factor VIII usage in both cohorts. We see continued improvement reflecting cessation of bleeding and quality of life and freedom from worry and an increased independence from treatment in our patient group. As mentioned, the factor VIII activity levels in the 6E13 cohort are settling within the normal range, and in the 4E13 cohort are settling within the upper range of mild hemophilia. The patterns for this settling out of factor VIII level are consistent with other preclinical and clinical reports, as I've highlighted on the previous slide, which is both cross-vector and cross-species in the observations. So we continue to feel that gene therapy has a huge potential to transform the standard of care and can offer opportunities for our patients which we previously could only dream of. Thank you. And just before I finish, I'd like to thank the principal investigator, Savita Rajawaran in Hampshire, our team at the Royal London at Barts Health, David Perry and Emily Symington in Cambridge, Bella Madden at Guy's and St Thomas's, Will Lester at Queen Elizabeth in Birmingham, and Mike Lafan at Imperial. And of course, we cannot forget the huge input, support from the team at BioMarin. This is absolutely a program you cannot do on your own, and we really want to say thank you to the whole team. Thank you.